Hi, Glenys.
Hey, Aaron. What do you want to talk about today?
How much I hate diets.
Yeah, diets suck.
So what do you do instead of a diet?
Intuitive eating. Health at every size.
So how many times have you had to explain intuitive eating and health at every size to someone?
Like 5,000 times. But that was just to my doctor.
Okay, so how many times have you explained it to someone and then they said, but diets are the only thing I know?
That's like every time. Can we pursue health without thinking about weight?
Yes, we can pursue health without thinking about weight.
That's pretty revolutionary, what you just said. But what if you just don't like yourself at the size that you're at?
I think we need to understand why, instead of just saying I need to change.
So, what's the deal with body positivity?
Oh man, that's a long answer. I'm Aaron Flores.
And I'm Glenys Oyston. And we are Dietitians Unplugged.
Howdy, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of Dietitians Unplugged. How are you, Glenys?
I'm good. We are chugging along in the new year and new decade. And everything's exciting and we're in the future now. So
now, wait, hold on. Isn't there like a lot of discussion if this is the new decade? Doesn't it start with 1 or 0?
0.
All right.
I mean, because the 2000 wasn't a part of the 90s.
There was no year 0. So 1 started like a new decade.
2000. This is 0.
All right, I'm just saying.
I don't know. It's too complicated. We're in a new decade. We've all been through all the lists of the best of the last decade. We're sick of the last decade. We
made so many too.
Huh? Best of?
Oh, yeah.
Did we?
Yeah. Best podcasts that are based out of remote locations in Southern California.
Yeah. List of 1.
Best podcast with a pink background on their cover art.
True.
So we're crushing it.
Yeah. These are mostly lists of 1, so.
Yeah, but it's all right. We made
it. Right. What's new with you?
You know, just a lot of things that are just continue to chug along. I have a new role at Center for Discovery that I'm really excited about, doing a lot of like HAES advocacy work throughout their entire company. So, which is great. I'm so happy that they've really embraced this paradigm, and I'm happy to be helping them implement it throughout all levels of care and all levels of work that they're doing. And my private practice is going along, and it's really enjoyable. And I just love the work I get to do. It's really, I consider myself truly one of the fortunate ones because I do love coming to work every day, no matter what it is. And it's very rewarding.
Yeah, that's great. And I am now full-time private practice, and
Woo-hoo!
I have some spots for a few more clients. So just thinking about how I'm going to be running my practice over the next few years. I think I'm going to maybe make some changes, but I am still primarily doing the work with, people who have a long history of dieting and maybe who are in this situation where they feel like they're binge eating or overeating or emotional eating, or that there's something wrong with their eating. Those are the folks that I'm helping out, especially people in higher weight bodies, providing compassionate care that they might not be getting at the doctor, which we talked about today with our guest, Whitney Catalano.
Yeah.
Do you want to introduce her?
Yeah. So Whitney Catalano is a registered dietitian. She's an anti-diet registered dietitian. Thank goodness. We need more of those. And she's helping people break free from the diet binge cycle and heal their relationship with food, make peace with their bodies, and take the power back from the inner bullies. She's the host of the popular podcast Trust Your Body Project, where she treats her listeners to interviews with guest experts as well as solo episodes. Trust Your Body Project is not just a podcast, though, but a growing social media movement aimed towards eliminating societal cultures around important topics such as weight stigma, eating disorders, emotional eating, fat culture, and food addiction, amongst others. With her vulnerability and honest, no-filter approach to tough topics, Whitney inspires countless women to own their bodies and regain confidence.
And she's amazing. She's amazing. We loved talking to her today.
Yeah, I think folks are really going to enjoy her take on a lot of these topics that we addressed in the episode.
Yeah. And I just wanted to make a little sponsorship announcement. This
Sure, go for
This
it.
episode is brought to you by us and the money out of our pockets. And in order to support this podcast, just become our clients. And that's all we're asking.
A simple ask.
It's a simple ask. We provide this podcast as a free resource for people. And we do pay for it to be produced. Otherwise, we'd be spending all our time sitting at the editing board here. And so, but we don't want to ask for money right now anyway, to produce it. But the best way, not making any promises, but the best way to support it is to think about if you need help with food or eating or anything, just, reach out, give us a little email and become our clients. And that helps us to continue on with this podcast.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So without further ado, here is our interview with Whitney Catalano. Whitney, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're really excited to talk to you. We love the work you're doing out there. So our listeners are really going to enjoy hearing all the things you have to say. We love hearing like a good origin story, though. So can you give us a little background about just how you came to this work? And, oftentimes as dietitians, we're not really trained from a health at every size paradigm. So, did you learn about this during school or after school? Just give us a little idea how you got here.
Yeah. So, I definitely did not learn about this during school, which is unfortunate. I started my dietetics program when I was in college, and I was originally a psych major and had disordered eating and struggled with binge eating and thought that, learning about nutrition was going to be the answer to all my problems, and found out that my school offered a dietetics program. I didn't even know what a dietitian was when I first decided to switch my major. I just did some research and was like, this is awesome. I had no idea my school had this amazing program. And when I switched, it was exactly what I was kind of expecting it to be, this learning all about nutrition. And I didn't realize how clinical it was going to be, but I was loving it because I wanted to learn as much as possible, because I was so sort of in the thick of needing to control food and needing to have all the information, have all the answers. And it really wasn't until after, when I was in my dietetic internship, that I even came across health at every size and had no idea what it was and just started dabbling in it a bit. What I thought it was when I first came across it is not what I know it to be now, but there's always that first exposure where you're like, what is this world? And then from there, I just kind of fell down the rabbit hole and there's really no going back. So that's how I got here.
I love how you just said when I first learned about it, it's totally not what it is now for me. And I think that's so true for many of us. There's this evolution process in our work as we develop more and more. I love that you said that.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because it's not the easiest thing to learn about right off the bat when you do a little bit of a Google search or whatever. It's not the easiest thing to understand. It takes some deep dives. So, I find that curious.
Can you just say a bit more about what you felt it was in the beginning when you first learned about it?
The reason why I learned about it was because I had to do a community nutrition program where we had to put on classes for different populations. And one of the populations was high school students. And I wanted to teach them, I felt really uncomfortable teaching high school students about this is a healthy plate and da 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 da. It just felt a little bit weird. And so I was kind of well, when I was in high school, I was struggling with body image and I was struggling with this and this and that. So I wonder if there's a way to go about this. And so I stumbled across Health at Every Size and I found this PowerPoint on one of the websites, and it talked about black and white thinking, and it talked about, some of the different concepts that are common in the Health at Every Size anti-diet discussions, but it didn't really talk about health at every size, which I thought was interesting. It didn't go into depth about, the myths around weight or anything like that. It just kind of previewed some of it and demonstrated some concepts and then has some activities. So I used it for that group, and that was kind of my introductory exposure to it all. But it wasn't until I really started reading, I fell down the rabbit holes of reading the book. And the ironic part is that I think most people start with the Health at Every Size book, but then I actually went back to the Health at Every Size book. And I know Linda Bacon even says this, like, don't read that book, read Body Respect. But I went back to that book recently and I was like, oh yeah, because this is like kind of problematic. Like it has its issues, whereas Body Respect is definitely a little bit like farther along in this conversation. So yeah, that was my introduction. And I was asking people, I remember asking people in my internship, like, do you know what Health at Every Size is? And what do you think about it? And no one knew. Like my internship director didn't know what it was. Like no one in my program knew. And so I just find it really interesting now because I'm sure they all follow me and they're like now learning about it, of course.
So interesting.
So you do some work now with emotional eating and binge eating. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Is that sort of your jam?
Yeah. So it's really just helping people with a history of chronic dieting. I tend to work with people in their 40s and 50s who have been dieting for, decades, and really just it affects every single area of their life. And so binge eating is sort of this natural consequence that happens from so much restriction. And I don't really treat it as like, I don't treat binge eating as a problem itself. I treat it as a symptom. And emotional eating, kind of the same thing, because 10 out of 10 times these clients who find me are, not only have they been dieting for so long, but it was a tool for avoiding their emotions or controlling their body when they couldn't control the things going on at home. And also learn from their parents, like, it's not okay to feel feelings. It's not okay to express your emotions. And, it's this kind of compounded effect. And it doesn't matter how many times I kind of talk about the same thing. I still find so many people who fit this mold and they all think that they're the only one struggling with it. And it's just fascinating to me because it's such a problem. Like it's such a problem how this diet culture and, neglecting your emotional needs and like learning this all from your parents is so common.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if you're finding the same thing that, I think both Erin and I find with clients is people come in thinking that they have a problem with binge eating or overeating or emotional eating. But in fact, what they have is a problem with not eating enough.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And feeling like they shouldn't be eating.
Yeah. I actually work with clients too. I tend to work with clients who, for no, intention of my own, who spent time in Overeaters Anonymous. And this sort of restricts your overeating problem, or like you're a food addict approach just obviously didn't work. And then they come find me. And so unlearning that stuff is really, really interesting because it's like such a loud voice in their heads and definitely takes some time.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, just following on that then, do you have people coming in saying, I have emotional eating, other people saying I have binge eating or overeating? And how do you explain the difference between those two? Or do you?
Yeah, no, I explain the difference. The way that I like to see it is that they can kind of blend because sometimes obviously binge eating can be a response to suppressing emotions, especially when binge eating, I always try to find out like when did the binge eating start? For some of my clients, it started in childhood, sometimes in response to deprivation and sometimes in response to just, a traumatic event or something. And so there's kind of pre-dieting binge eating and diet caused binge eating. So I try to identify that first and foremost because binge eating that developed before the client or person started dieting, even if it was very young, that tends to be more emotional. It's like an emotional dissociation response, whereas binge eating that developed in response to restriction can also be very emotional, like, let me, hide the food, or if everyone's gone, I'm going to go binge and I'm going to go dissociate. But also it's this like direct physiological, pendulum swing from restriction. And I kind of like to look at the differences and ask them, what is your experience? Like binge eating can really feel like this out of control tunnel vision. Like I have to eat all the food right now. And then emotional eating, I think I'm like all for emotional eating, and I'm like, have emotional eating and have 1,000 other tools to deal with your emotions. And typically emotional eating kind of goes away once you have so many other tools. But sometimes like we just need to eat like an emotional, quesadilla or something. Like it's not a big deal. And I really help them distinguish between the two because I have clients who will describe something as a binge, and I'll ask them like, what actually happened? And I'm like, that's not a binge. Like that's, I think these words are thrown around a lot. And so there's a lot of confusion about what actually like constitutes a binge. And unfortunately, diet culture has made it so even eating slightly past the point of fullness seems like a binge. And you're like, no, that's just like you ate a little past the point of fullness,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'll have people say to me, I binged, and it was like 2 things. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not really a binge. I hate to tell you. I know it feels like one to you, but, and then people will ask like, well, what's a binge? How do you know what a binge is? So what, do you ever have people asking you that?
Yeah. Would you like me to quickly run through it? Yeah. So, I mean, there's 2 different kinds of binges. There's, what's called, in the research really, and I like these definitions. So there's a subjective and an objective. I think the commonality between the 2 is that you're very dissociated, tunnel visioned. It's almost like you have no control. And it's not in the sense of like, I have no control, I have no willpower, not in the personal narrative sense of not having control, but in like literally your body has taken over. I always describe it as like, you've been restricting and your body has said, you're done here. It's my turn. Like I'm in charge now. So your body takes the wheel and it just goes for it. It finds the food. All you can think about is food. And there's no sort of conscious awareness of how much you're eating. You're just going until your body calms down. So that's consistent between the 2. And it's also another thing that's consistent between the 2 is like high levels of guilt and shame afterwards. And secrecy and all of this stuff, which anyone who feels like they struggle with binge eating will, struggle with shame and guilt, especially living in our culture. So that's kind of the similarity between the 2. And then subjective and objective, the way that they define it in the research is really just the amount and the time. I'm not a really big fan of like bringing amounts into this necessarily. Sometimes I will, in the sense that like feeling like you can't stop eating peanut butter one day, but it's really only a couple spoonfuls. That's more of a perception issue where I'm like, well, why do you feel like that's out of control? Because it's that, like, what diet did you get that from, basically? Because our viewpoint of what's out of control can be so messed up from dieting, because dieting is like so restrictive. And like some diets are way more restrictive than others. So I talk a lot about, what actually is a binge and what's just like you needed a little bit more food today. But I don't really like to put I know in the research they put like calorie limits or whatever on a subjective versus objective binge. I just like to look at the experience and ask them, where the shame is coming from and, why it matters if the amount of food makes a difference, and explore that. And then typically it's just the perception of feeling out of control, feeling like you're not even in charge of your body in that moment. Like you've completely detached from what your body is doing. And how can we sort of pick that apart, remove the shame piece of it, and really aim to understand it?
I also love how you mentioned the emotional eating piece. We just did a podcast episode about that very topic, and it was very similar, right? About how we can try to normalize some emotional eating instead of demonizing it, because that's so much of what diet culture tells us to do. So I think the explanation you gave us is really great. And I think it is gray, right? It is hard to sort of figure out sometimes, and that's sort of why we're here too, right? Is to help people sort of unpack some of that stuff in a more sort of non-judgmental way than letting their inner critic take over and do it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So for anyone who isn't following you on Instagram, they should definitely follow you. You have awesome content that you're always updating, and I love it. One of my favorites is you have this highlighted Instagram story about doctor's visits and weight stigma in the medical setting. And for those who haven't seen it, maybe you can explain just a little bit about that, but also like what are some tools that you give your clients to feel empowered in that visit that can be incredibly stigmatizing?
Yeah. So that was a really interesting experience for me. I live in LA and I had to find a new doctor because I just moved. And so I went to this doctor in Beverly Hills, and I was already a little bit skeptical because it's Beverly Hills and whatever. So I was just like, we'll see what happens, you know? So I went to this doctor and I really liked the doctor the first time around, but the second time I went, so I went for an initial visit and then I went for a follow-up after I got blood work and stuff done. And they took my weight at the initial assessment, and that makes sense because this is the first time I'm ever seeing this doctor. I understand that they need it on file. I wish that blind weighing was just a requirement, basically. Like I wish every single doctor's office did this, but the wishful thinking. So I went, and just for, perspective on this, like I'm definitely in a smaller body. And so this to me was very eye-opening because I was like, if this is happening to me, I just don't understand. Yeah. So it was definitely jarring, and it was not the doctor who said or did anything. It was the nurse who, after I told the story, it became clear that this guy probably wasn't a nurse. He was probably some sort of technician of some kind. Like it wasn't an actual registered nurse or anything like that, because whatever, I got schooled on the different roles in a private practice. So I don't want to give nurses a bad name necessarily, but basically he made a comment. I was like, hey, I don't want to be weighed. It was this whole sort of back and forth battle. And then I was like, no, I just got weighed a month ago. I really don't see why you need my weight. And then I tried to explain and educate him and take this opportunity because I'm a professional, and I, was able to calm down the nervous system response and really, stay grounded in what I was doing. And I saw an opportunity to educate on why that was just not the way to go about it, and why it's so important that if someone tells him, hey, I have a history of disordered eating, you do not weigh the person. Mm-hmm. And he basically made a comment you don't look like you had a eating disorder or whatever. And I was like, well, what does that mean? So it was this whole oh, you look really fit, you look really healthy or whatever. And I was just like, what are you saying to me right now? I don't understand why you find this okay. I don't even think this is okay. And it's just, I felt, ugh.
It's almost like, what planet am I on? Who's filming me? Is this candid camera?
Yeah.
Right?
How did I end up?
On? Yeah.
And it was just a little greasy, it was a little slimy. It wasn't as, I don't know. Yeah, it was icky. So I really calmed down. I tried to be super respectful because I wanted to educate. And I explained, eating disorders don't have a look. It's all mental. And you could tell he just did not understand. And to his credit, he asked follow-up questions, phrased terribly, but he asked follow-up questions. So I was like, okay, whatever. So I explained it's very mental. This is something I don't know why, I can't, explain why this is, but it just is the way it is, that my brain will take a number and it'll run with it. And it's just not okay. And if anyone tells you this, this is what you should do, da, 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 da. I ended up telling the doctor, she was like, oh Lord, I need to have a little education with him. And I was like, yes, you do. So, it was just a really interesting experience. And so I came home and I just filmed this whole thing about it. And I had actually just given a talk to one of the local California Academy meetings about weight stigma at Health at Every Size. So I literally had a PowerPoint up about the theory of stigma and all of this stuff. And so I just went through it with my phone explaining here, we think that weight causes health issues because that's what everyone tells us. But in reality, we have to look at the fact that we don't have conclusive evidence that the presence of fat on the body is what's causing health issues. And what we do have evidence of is that stigma directly causes health issues. And doctors are the number one and number two perpetuators of stigma for men and women respectively. Oh, women and men maybe respectively. I might mix those up, so don't quote me on it. But it's a really big problem. And I talked in this PowerPoint about how dietitians perpetuate weight stigma, how doctors, how nurses, and there's all this research around it. And this is actually what happens in the body physiologically and da, da, da. So I went through this whole thing, and it was really fascinating for my audience because I think, one, they didn't understand that there's an option to not be weighed or to speak up or to advocate for yourself. And then two, didn't understand really the nuance of how stigma plays into the myths around health.
Yeah.
So I tried to provide a lot of resources around, if you feel comfortable saying something, then come with something written. That's something I always recommend. Sometimes I'll write letters for my clients. So I'll say, you know, this is her or his dietitian. Please don't talk about weight, or like, please do a blind weighing. Here's some resources. Like, sincerely, you know, I kind of have a template for it.
Yeah.
Other times I'll have them write something down. So it just kind of depends on the situation and what they're comfortable with. And really just, you know, giving people tools at different levels, depending on, because it's a really anxiety inducing experience. And not only that, but we actually have research that stigma in a medical practice causes patients to like completely shut down and not be able to speak up and advocate for themselves or communicate. So it's just like, it's all there.
Yeah.
It's all in the research.
Yeah. Just so I'm clear, because I didn't see I'm not on Instagram, so one of the only humans on earth apparently not on Instagram. But so I didn't see your story. But so you had told the person that on your follow-up visit, like, I don't want to get weighed, and what was his response?
His response was basically like, no, you have to, it's protocol. And I was like, no, I don't. I was just here less than a month ago. Like, I don't think I've changed.
Fascinating.
I would let you know, if I had any major weight changes, like if I had dramatic weight changes between a month ago and now, like I would let you know, because that would be I see weight now as a symptom. It's like, once you heal your relationship with food and you have a relatively normal relationship with food, like your weight doesn't change that much unless something's going on. Like, it is a symptom, or it can be a symptom. And so if I had rapid weight changes in either direction in a month, I mean, I would be raising red flags too, because I'd be like, is there something hormonally going on? Is there something like that is my thyroid shutting down? Like, what is happening? Am I on a new medication? Like, I obviously wasn't, but it can be a symptom response, or like a symptom that lets us know that, hey, maybe something is dysregulated in the body that you got to go check out. And that's the way that weight should be used, like any other measure, right? Like rapid weight changes you should go see a doctor if you're not changing anything in your life, because you may have a hormonal condition that is, something's going on, and it's a good idea to go see the doctor if that's happening. But I take, that doesn't really apply if you're restricting and binging and restricting and binging, because weight can change really rapidly in those situations. And like, that's pretty normal considering the binge restrict cycle,
Yeah. And I try to always remind people about the weight thing. So they're obviously just trying to collect a metric so that they get like a full reimbursement. But if they put refused, that counts as them collecting the weight.
Right.
So, or somebody else has said, or they could do another metric. So you could say, you can take my height if you want.
Interesting.
Or, there's other things they can do. But I think it's important for us to all know we do not have to be subjected to any medical procedure that we don't want to be. And that's a medical procedure.
Yeah. And he was very much like, he gave that look of, okay, if you're sure, I'm just going to put down that you refused, like kind of that sort of a voice.
You're going to get the black mark beside your name.
Yeah. And I was like, that's fine. I'm never going to see this paperwork. Like, I don't care.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So interesting. Yeah. I mean, when I go to the doctor, I just went this past week, and they're like, okay, and you just have to step on here. And I just look and I go, oh no, I don't do that. And then there's a pause. There's an awkward pause of like, they're like, I think she said something official that I don't understand. And then they go, oh, okay. And then we walk past the scale. So I think if you just sort of, what I encourage is just go in there and act like it's not something you have to do. But again, even I can kind of melt down in the presence of the doctor, because it's like, hey, there's a power differential here. Like, you have the power to treat me and also to not treat me if I'm not being a compliant patient.
Right.
And that's really scary.
Which actually just came up for someone I'm working with. They sent a similar letter that Whitney you're talking about. And they were, the doctor was like, I don't know if I can treat you given these, your ask of not being weighed and having weight loss not be a topic of discussion. And I was floored. I've never heard of that happening.
It's ridiculous. That makes me really sad, because, it's just it shouldn't be relevant. And the only reason that it is relevant in the sense of, if they need to take a blind weight and they need to have weight is like medical dosing or like medicine dosing. And, I'm sure around surgery, like it's important to have this information for some reason. Like, I don't know, I'm not a doctor or surgeon, but I'm sure it's important to have this information, but that doesn't mean that the doctor needs to be talking about weight or weight loss. And yeah, I don't know. It's just that really concerns me.
Yeah, well, because it's the number one question I get from my clients is, where do I find a good doctor?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, seriously, it's like probably, if one of the top things that comes up with my clients. So I think if we can, as a community, really come up with resources that help, they're important. And then to hear that some of those resources are getting sort of that response is concerning.
Yeah, it is. And, the Health at Every Size Registry and Fat Friendly Docs, those are two great websites, but they're not at all going to cover where most people live.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Whitney, going back to how you sort of first came to Health at Every Size and how you said you sort of see it differently now, I'm wondering if that part is the sort of the increase in awareness of weight stigma. Because I feel like we weren't talking about that as early. And, when I first learned about Health at Every Size, it was there, but I feel like we've come a long way on that. Is that something you've experienced?
Yeah, definitely. I think that weight stigma is such an important part of this conversation because Health at Every Size, I think a great beginner way to explain Health at Every Size for people is just, it's about health behaviors, not about weight loss. And that's a really good introductory thing of like, oh, that makes sense. You eat fruits and vegetables and you go for walks and like like whatever you want to do, to support your health. And like anyone can do those things. And it's finding out the things that work for you and your body and pursuing health. But then the question always comes up around, well, isn't it bad to be fat? Like that's always the thing that I get asked. And that's why it's so important to be talking about weight stigma. And I really like Dr. Tomiyama's, like I was reading through one of her articles about, she's a researcher, and I was reading through one of her research articles about the theory of weight stigma. And she's got this whole model. And this is what I was showing on my Instagram story of how weight stigma, like what this theory is saying is that basically the experience of weight stigma is contributing more to the health disparities between body sizes than the actual presence of fat itself. And it makes perfect sense because, marginalization and poverty are two of the most important, predictors of health outcomes because we're talking about chronic stress on the body. And we all know that chronic stress is not good for you. Like it's not good for your body. It's not good for your health. Like stress is harmful. Like it's harmful for the body. And to be exposed to highly, highly stressful information and experiences every single day because of your body size, like, yeah, that's going to create some health issues. And if we're not talking about that stuff, we're really doing a disservice to clients. And I think, the biggest thing is that we're never going to see progress in the way that people of all body sizes are treated if we don't tackle this first in the medical community, because the medical community is making it okay.
Yeah, it seems like such a systematic change that we need to sort of think about, but also, if we think about it, like, sort of the work that's involved there, but also like as we do more and more of this work individually is helping spread just that message that you just talked about, right? Of the health impact of other things like poverty, right? Things that we don't necessarily think about, but are real. And the more we can include them, actually sort of helps us, look at our own bodies and our own experiences in a much more compassionate way.
Exactly. And really understand that there aren't, this isn't a conversation of everything is within your control. And if you're, if you have health issues or whatever, then it's your fault, and I think that's the way that our medical system has really gone is let's, put all of the responsibility on the individual. And, I understand individual responsibility around, there's certain things you can do to support your health and to help people feel empowered to do those things. But weight should not be a part of that conversation.
Yeah. How often does this conversation around weight stigma come up in your practice and working with clients?
I mean, I talk about it all the time. It's one of those things that I talk about it in multiple layers. So for starters, I talk about it around sort of with every client I have a certain number of topics that I discuss with people, and that always comes up. It's one of those things that's like every single client hears about it. I'll discuss how, like, because clients always eventually will ask me, because I tend to work with a lot of clients in bigger bodies, and they'll always ask me, okay, but what about like the health and weight component? And we just have to talk about that, because it's most of my clients, like, you don't start dieting for, weight loss and to look a certain way, but it also gets translated because they have their parents or their friends or their whoever who are constantly being like, I'm just worried about you, like, getting diabetes or whatever ridiculous thing that they say. And so then it's like they really internalize that. And of course they do. It's of course that is an internalized message, because everyone around you is being like, you're going to die. And it's like, that's not, first of all, why do we feel like that's okay to say? But, we end up talking about it eventually, but we also talk about it in the context of childhood trauma and what I call weight trauma. And whenever I talk about trauma in my practice, I talk about trauma from a lowercase t. So when we think capital T trauma, we think, abuse, assault, things like that, these sort of really big instances that everyone tends to compare themselves like, no, none of that stuff happens to me, so I had a good childhood. And I'm like, well, your parents were really emotionally unavailable. They put you on diets from a young age. They made you feel terrible about your body, and they didn't make it safe for you to process your feelings. Like, that's all trauma. And yes, it's not, physical abuse, but it doesn't mean that didn't like seriously affect your psyche, and you have a lot of healing to do around that. And everyone has experienced trauma at some point or another, because there's one theory around trauma that it's like this, any, length of time where you're disconnected from yourself. And we've all experienced different kinds of trauma. And I like to make trauma a very normal conversation. Like, everyone has trauma. Let's all work on healing it. Like, we all have, different ways that it shows up in our lives as adults. And let's go back and figure out what that is. And so when we talk about weight stigma, we talk about, okay, so how is weight stigma directly affecting your parents as well? How is weight stigma directly affecting you as a child? And like, what different things did you experience that made it feel very unsafe to be living in your body?
Yeah, I love that. Where can people find more about what you do and your work, and if they're interested in maybe doing even some work with you individually?
Yeah. So my website, whitneycatalano.com, has kind of everything, my podcast and all of that. You can find me on Instagram at Trust Your Body Project, and on Twitter at Whitney Catalano. Twitter's where I kind of like go off on my uncensored tangents. And then I bring, the things that do well over to Instagram. And then I'm actually writing a book in January. I'm starting my book, so it'll be out sometime next year, about emotional eating, which I'm really excited about. So yeah, it's all there.
Excellent. Well, we will be sure and put links to all of those in the show notes so people can find you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. So thanks a lot.